So the figurine of the title, was that the inspiration behind the whole book, or did you come to the figurine kind of in the middle of the story?
Oh, I come to the figurine really inspired by another much greater theft. So my novel is ostensibly about the theft of a little 5,000-year-old Cycladic Greek statuette of a woman.
And these do exist, these statuettes?
They do exist, and they're found by archaeologists all around the Aegean, not in huge numbers, and any that are absolutely whole and undamaged are very, very rare. Most of them are found in graves, and they're very mysterious. 95% of them are female, and they're designed to lie down. So very often they are found in a grave next to the bones of the deceased from 5,000 years ago. And nobody really thought much of them when they were found until Picasso and Modigliani and all the modern artists began to see them and to be very inspired, and they sort of became an icon for a modern art movement.
Yeah.
And therefore became incredibly valuable. And now, you'd have to pay up to $16 million for one of these beautiful things. And legally, you're not allowed to buy and sell them. They are restricted and regarded as very valuable. But when I came across these figurines myself for the first time and just adored the aesthetics of them, they are extremely beautiful. They're like a little mini supermodel goddess, and very lovely.
They're sort of doll size.
They are doll size. They're less than a foot in height.
Yeah.
But what had been interesting me for a little bit longer than that was this sort of big controversy over the theft of the what I call the Parthenon sculptures, and some people call them the Elgin Marbles.
Yes.
And there's always a little bit of a tussle. And I got very interested in that subject because I was always being nagged, which is quite a polite word, by my Greek friends and people who interviewed me in Greece about what I thought about where the ones that we have in the British Museum should really be. And there's a huge movement to have them return to Athens, because it's as though we have a bit of a jigsaw here, and where they came from is waiting for them. And I always sat on the fence. It made me unpopular in Greece because I wouldn't actually say, yes, it's disgraceful, I believe they should go back, because I loved the British Museum so much and felt they did a good job there of showing Greek culture to tourists. But then I began to read about how Elgin actually extracted them from the Parthenon temple, and why he did. And essentially they were for his own house that he was building in Scotland. They were never intended for us to see. They were just going to, decorate this very fancy pad that he was building for himself. So it was a very selfish act, which he did illegally. He wasn't given permission to take them. And by the time he got back with these shiploads of sculptures, some of which had already sunk to the bottom of the Aegean and had to be hoiked up by divers, he was bankrupt when he got back. He'd spent all his money on this 2-year operation to remove these sculptures and have them brought back to...
So Fancy Pad never happened?
Fancy Pad never happened. His wife, by the time he got home, his wife had left him, and he had a very expensive divorce case on his hands.
Okay.
So he had no money. And the British government essentially bailed him out, this sort of bankrupt no-gooder, which is how I really regard him. He was an ambassador, but, he was an aristocrat, I think it wasn't such a difficult job to get yourself in those days. So they gave him £35,000, which covered the cost of the transport and the paying of the team to remove them. I could lecture on about this for hours,
this is a fascinating story.
But all of this was my sort of burning inspiration that made me want to write a novel about the theft and the whole idea of where home is for a valuable cultural artifact. And although, you know, I love the figurine very much, beneath the surface is a very passionate view I have that we shouldn't half-inch things from other countries,
Yes,
and then put them in our museums and say, aren't we marvellous, this is ours, come and have a look, because many of the things that we have in our museums are not ours in the sense that you and I think
but
of
we
ours.
we should point out that the novel isn't about Elgin. It's about
not.
Helena.
It's about Helena.
And we join her as a very young girl. Is it 1968?
Yeah, she's 8 years old, and she visits Athens for the first time, goes to stay with her grandparents, who are Greek, and her mother is Greek, her father is actually Scottish. And through the eyes of this little girl, we see an Athens that actually we wouldn't recognise today, because in that period, in the late 60s, early 70s, it was under a military dictatorship, the junta, who were 3 colonels who took over the country in April 1967. And through her sort of innocent eyes, she observes things that gradually reveal to her the kind of regime that the country is under, and her grandfather's own very big involvement in it. So, you know, you think of your grandparents being lovely, cuddly people, always reliable. The first time in her life she meets somebody who is actually very cold and heartless, and she's sort of on the receiving end of some of his brutality. So the years go by and she learns more and more about him, about how he's behaved, and indeed about how he has actually received many stolen artefacts. So her task as an adult is how she makes recompense for what he's done.
And you write really well about kind of university life and the kind of the crushes and the disastrous love affairs and the friendships and all of that sort of stuff. Did it kind of whet your appetite? Did you think, oh, maybe I could write a book where there's no Greece in it at all?
I struggle to do that.
Oh, did you?
But I'm quite pleased with the character of Helena, because she is the most, even though she's half Greek, she's the most British character I've written. Well, then I wouldn't have such an excuse to spend a lot of time in Greece, would I? If
You don't need an excuse. Just head out there. You'll be welcomed with open arms. Particularly now you've got off the Elgin Marble fence. I mean, they'll be loving you.
Yes, absolutely. I'll get a free pass. But I just cannot see myself finding a story, finding something that really inspires me, because ultimately it is a story about Greece.
Yeah.
And it's a story about her finding where she should be. So although it's about where the statuette's home really is, it's also about where her heart finally lives.
And the setting it in 1968, was that to get her to the right age, or did you want to explore that kind of dark bit of Greek history?
Yes, I've always wanted to write something with a big background of the junta, because it's so much closer than any other part of Greek history that I've written about. And of course it was in my lifetime.
And mine, and I felt so stupid because when I read about the junta, I kind of thought, oh yes, I do vaguely remember this. But I don't really remember how awful it was.
No, I mean, I think we remember the moment perhaps that the junta came to an end, which was triggered by the 1974 Cyprus invasion by Turkey. That was what actually brought the junta to a close. And I think that was when I began to read the newspaper, you know, when it wasn't just something sitting on the kitchen table that my parents read, because we had such a connection with that Cyprus situation. But that was all very much tied up with the Greek junta.
And when you talk to Greek people now, is it very kind of recent for them? Is it kind of like scratch the surface and they will have a terrible story?
Well, I hate to say this, but a lot of Greeks have quite fond memories of the period, because it was a time of prosperity for many people, and they really encouraged tourism, the junta. It was they saw the potential for bringing in income. So lots of places that have become resorts since that time. The big hotels there were originally built under the dictatorship. So it's a little bit of a mix. Occasionally I have to sort of tactfully walk away from someone I'm having a conversation with in Greece, because I assume that all my friends are sort of pretty socialist and liberal.
Yes.
And most of them are. But then I'll suddenly find an older person that will say, well, it was very safe to walk around in Athens in 1970. And I want to say to them, yeah, but you weren't allowed to have long hair. They arrested musicians and poets and writers and anyone who they've forgotten that bit. And there were a lot of people in exile. A lot of the really, people like Melina Mercouri, the famous actress who eventually became the Minister for Culture, they were in exile. They couldn't live under the colonels. So a bit of a mixed view, a little bit as it was when I wrote a book about the Greek Civil War. I'd suddenly find people coming down on me like a ton of bricks.
And do the books come out simultaneously in Greek?
They come out about a month later.
Oh, okay.
So I have a couple of weeks before, the avalanche of people saying, how dare you
the junta
criticise
hits
the junta.
the fan.
Yeah. But the official view of it is that they were disgraced. They were put on trial at the end, the colonels. I mean, they were treated as criminals. And in fact, some of them were sentenced to death. I think they didn't they didn't go through with it, but they were imprisoned for life for what they brought on the country. So, yeah, officially they are on the black pages of the history, the dark side. But there are many people who had fond memories of, how safe and lovely it was, because there were so many soldiers in the street. Nothing nasty ever happened.
Victoria Hislop, thank you so much for coming in to see us.
It's a huge pleasure.
Take care. Lovely to see you. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.